professor. The Economic Development Research Group that I work with actually also has a software line called Treadis, which is something that ITD is using and that Compass is using. And there is a free academic version of that, which has tutorials that we can make available if you want to play with, and you can actually do the kinds of things we're talking about here tonight and see how it comes out and learn hands-on about how to actually do this. Tonight we're not going to really be focusing on how to do it so much as just what it is. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about how to do it. But just for the students, if you're interested, we have an interesting tutorial and an interesting educational opportunity. So I would point that out. You can see me about it afterwards if you're interested. So I'm going to, I hope that doesn't look fuzzy. I'm going to start with, so we're going to have, like I said, we're going to have two parts. The first part is just going to be getting familiar with what the heck we're talking about when we talk about these transportation economic things. And the second part is going to be, well, what does it really mean for you? How might you have this conversation with people who aren't speaking transportation economics, but who are just kind of like normal people? And I think that what we'll do is we'll kind of have a little discussion after this part, and then we'll take a short break, and then we'll have the next part, and we will have more discussion. If the technical aspect of this part of the presentation is, you find yourself kind of nodding off or anything, hang in there with me because the next part is going to be a lot less technical. So, with that said, we'll start by talking about speaking transportation economics and actually making sense out of some of the things that we talk about. And I'm going to just kind of jump right into it. How many people here have heard people talk about cost-benefit analysis or benefit-cost analysis, and they talk about having a BC ratio and that kind of thing? People hear those terms thrown around. And a lot of times when you hear that, somebody might say, well, transportation investment is worth so many $1 billion or so many millions of dollars. And it's like, okay, what is in that number? What does that mean? And sometimes it gets even more confusing when they start saying, well, you have a transportation benefit of $4 billion, but yet I'm going to get $6 billion of business sales out of it. Well, how can you have so many different numbers floating around? And the beginning of transportation, how transportation affects the economy and why you should care about it, is really in the benefits of transportation investment. So what do we mean by benefit? What qualifies to be a benefit? Well, the benefit of a transportation investment is always an absolute gain to the economy. What that means is it's not just something moving around within the economy, it's actually you're better off, and you can measure the way that you're better off in dollars. So for example, if you go into a transportation network and you really improve a particular freeway or highway or other system, and that is basically making a lot of people better off, but then you do it at the expense of letting something else deteriorate, you may or may not have a net benefit from what you're doing. A benefit always requires that people are better off and that you're not just moving money around or moving problems around. So the benefits arise in the economy from transportation investment. Either the first way is by saving money. If you can actually enable households and businesses to do what they're doing now, and they don't have to spend as much money on the transportation part of that activity, that savings is a benefit because it isn't costing anyone else anything more. Or the cost could be measured in a separate part of the analysis. But effectively, if you can save money to households or businesses, that is one type of benefit that we usually see reported in the transportation economic analysis. Another thing that can happen with transportation investment is it can increase the productivity of businesses. And you can count that as a benefit. If a business, for the same $3 million or whatever it spends to operate its plant, it can produce $4 million worth of output, whereas before it was only producing $3.5 million worth of output, that is a benefit to society. The other thing that we consider a benefit is if you're attracting or creating or doing something that is enabling a new economic activity to occur that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. And the important aspect of that is it has to actually be new. So in order for it to be a benefit, you actually have to be, say you attract a new Motorola plant to come from China and come here to Idaho. Well, what that plant contributes to your gross regional product could be thought of as a benefit, at least from Idaho's point of view. However, if you move one plant from one side of Boise and move it over to Idaho Falls, and it's making the exact same production with the exact same amount of cost, there's no real benefit to doing that. In fact, you may have even imposed a cost by luring this company to spend all the money to relocate. That is not considered a benefit. So the benefit, in other words, it has to really be something that is new and that in absolute terms is making the state's economy bigger. And it will usually be one of those three things. Now the other way when I talk about productivity is from an engineering perspective for people who are interested in saying, I'm not really going to necessarily attract new business, but I have there was an example in one state of a Campbell's soup factory. And if their access to the freeway could actually be changed such that they could use their existing site and they could make twice as much soup simply because of the way that their site is laid out, and you can come up with an engineering solution that enables them to do that, you can count the profitability of that increased productivity as part of your benefit if you want. So these are the things that happen that basically can cause benefits to occur from transportation projects. Now to get into the money-saving benefits, that was the first class of benefits that I talked about. Money-saving benefits that can occur because you're investing in the transportation system. And when you look at benefits, another thing I should say about them is they're always relative to some base case. You can never say, what is the benefit of just doing exactly what I'm doing now? Or what is the benefit, unless you compare it to doing nothing. To have a benefit, you have to consider two possible futures. A future where I do the thing I'm thinking about doing, whether it's building a road or a highway or improving transit or whatever, and I have to compare that to a world where I don't do that. And so there always has to be a base case and an improved case. And you usually will look at those benefits cumulatively over many years, like out to 20, 30 years. And you add them all up, and then they get discounted, which means that you're comparing them to a comparable investment by discounting them based on an interest rate. So basically, with that said about benefits, one of the money-saving benefits, the first kind that you can often see is vehicle operating cost. When people talk about saving vehicle operating cost as a benefit of a transportation investment, what we're talking about there is we are talking about the actual mileage-related costs of people driving on the system. That is usually based on a per mile cost. So for example, if you can make it possible for people to get somewhere from point A to point B while driving fewer miles, you are then saving them implicitly you're saving them their fuel, you're saving the wear and tear on the vehicle maintenance, you're saving them potentially some insurance money, but you're saving their vehicle operating costs. So when you hear about a vehicle operating cost benefit, what you're really talking about is the fact that you do something on the transportation system and people have to drive less and therefore they save money. They save money on their cars and their fuel. Same activity, less mileage, or the same mileage but better traffic conditions. In some cases, you'll see that vehicle operating cost actually get better because if you resolve a bottleneck and you're not congested anymore, the actual the cost that imposes on your vehicle of not being in congested conditions is going to allow your vehicle to have a longer life. And you're going to have less maintenance on your vehicle because it's really hard on a vehicle to have to stop and go in congestion. So those are the kinds of things that are driving a vehicle operating cost improvement. So if you hear, oh, we have a real benefit in vehicle operating costs, you'll know that that's what they're talking about, something related to mileage and the number of cars making those miles or the conditions under which those miles are traveled. The other, another category of the money-saving benefits that we talk about when we talk about investing in the transportation system is we talk about travel time. Travel time is probably the leading benefit that you will usually hear about. And what travel time, just like it sounds like, is it's saying I can engage in the same activity with fewer hours. Okay, fewer hours over the course of a year, less time that I have to spend traveling to work. So if I can have the same job I have now, but I actually, instead of spending 30 minutes getting there, I can get there in 15 minutes. Over the course of a year, that time becomes valuable to me. That time also becomes valuable to my employer because I might actually be, able to get there and to be a little bit, to be able to spend a little bit more time working because I'm not ducking out early to get home in time because of the traffic. So you have the same activity, fewer hours spent doing it. This also applies to trucks. If you have a truck that's carrying several tons of goods, and those goods can actually get somewhere sooner, and so you don't have to spend as much travel time for the driver and the truck getting there, and you can get your goods to where they're going in 3 hours instead of 5 hours, actually being able to use those commodities, the things on that truck, being able to use that in the economy is worth money to people who make and sell things. And so that is another type of travel time benefit. So when you hear people talk about travel time savings as a benefit, they're actually talking about hours spent on the system for people or for goods. Now it's important to point out you can have a travel time benefit not necessarily by building something on the transportation system. You could also have a scenario where the transportation improvement is part of a land use transportation planning effort where you're actually bringing the people and their destinations or the goods and their destinations closer together so you can reduce travel time that way. But anytime that you were able to reduce travel time, you can claim a benefit for that. And you'll hear that talked about a lot when you get into conversations about why you're doing this. Another thing very closely related to travel time is reliability. Reliability has to do with greater certainty of when something is going to arrive or when something is going to have to leave. And how and why is reliability worth money? The reason why reliability is worth money and the reason why investing in transportation systems can make such a big difference to reliability is that if a transportation system is congested or if it's very close to its capacity, what will happen is there's very little give. If, say, you've got a really crowded road and you have one accident, one crash occurring on that fairly congested road, it's going to take a lot longer time for that traffic flow to recover, and it's going to be much more likely that you're going to have an incident that's going to disrupt that traffic flow because there isn't any room to get in and do much about it. And what the implication of that, and that's in the case of congestion, you can also have a reliability problem if you have, like out in rural Idaho, where you have a relatively sparse network and it's hard to find an alternate route, and all of a sudden what was a 1 hour drive for a truck, say, to deliver something to where it's going becomes, well, it's 3 times as long that you're driving, so you're not as sure. You used to be able to say, I can leave at 5 o'clock and get there by 8 o'clock, but now I might be getting there at 10 or 11, depending on a lot of things, because my trip's a lot longer. So what reliability, the effect that reliability has economically is that if I'm a manager and I'm running a factory and I don't know when my goods, my inputs to production are going to actually get there to help me make whatever I'm making, say I'm making computers and I've got a load of plastic or something that's coming in, and I don't know when it's going to get there, my whole supply chain, I have to build in what we call buffer time, or I have to build in another hour or 45 minutes or whatever it is that I might have all my crew standing there waiting to work on something, but the goods, they may get here at 8 o'clock, they may get here at 8:45. I've got to be ready to use them when they get here. So it's going to cost me money to have my whole supply chain stood up, waiting, and it doesn't matter. Even if the goods get there early, I still have to pay for that time, and I have to budget into my business operation the fact that there's this period of time in which things just might not get there. And so that time that I have to budget in has value, and it has very real economic value to a business. And probably you can experience that in your lifetime. Like, have people in your lifestyle, in your own home, like, are there anybody here that has actually left early when going to work because it's congested? And it's like, well, I don't know. It could take me 10 minutes, but if I got to be there at 8:30 and under free flow conditions, uncongested, it takes me 10 minutes to get there. I'm not going to leave at 8:20. I'm going to leave at 8 o'clock, right? Well, that 20 minutes is worth something to me, and that's a reliability cost. If you can create an improvement whereby the transportation system makes it more predictable, then you're going to accrue a significant benefit, and that you're going to be able to use that time, or a business is going to be able to use the money they spend for that time to do other things in the economy. Safety is something that's pretty well understood. You're having fewer crashes and fatalities, and you could have those by improving the design of a facility that is known to have a higher crash rate than maybe it could if you had a better design. You can also achieve that simply if you take vehicles off the road. That goes back to similar to vehicle operating costs. If you reduce the number of miles that cars and trucks have to travel for an activity, you're reducing their exposure to the risk that they might get into a crash. You can also, through certain types of design improvements, you can make the severity of crashes less. You can sometimes do things that might make you less likely to have a fatality. Guardrails are an example of things like this. And so these have a benefit, again, because they save the money that is lost. Obviously, when someone loses their life or someone has an injury or someone's property is damaged, there's a loss of money there. The statistical value of a life is never truly the philosophical value of a life. But if somebody dies, basically everything that they would have produced in their entire lifetime is lost. And that is a tremendous economic loss. So if you can save one or two people's lives, you can justify a lot of expensive transportation improvement to save just one life. So safety is a major area, and you'll hear people often talk about safety benefits, and that's what they're talking about. Then you have environmental benefits. Now really, environmental benefits, when we talk about it in strictly as an economic benefit, we're talking about that part of the environmental benefit that you can actually see showing up in transactions. So you're talking, when you talk about environmental benefit, and there are other types of environmental payoffs that you get that are harder to quantify. But here you're talking about emissions. You're talking about the fact that you have less emissions and pollutants in the air. You have a public health benefit that comes from that. You might have a wildlife benefit and other benefits associated with having cleaner air and better environmental conditions. So those are all of the money-saving benefits when you just compare your project to what would have happened without it. You also have productivity benefits you hear people talk about. And a productivity benefit is different than a savings benefit, because the savings benefits are all situations where you had a problem, you solved it by investing in the transportation system, and now you're better off and you can take the value of what you saved as a benefit. Well, you also can have productivity benefits. What that is that's a situation where you haven't actually saved any money, but yet you're now able to produce more. You're able to do more, even though you didn't save money. One good example of that is market access. The market access, when you hear people talk about a market access benefit, what that means is that you have a location. Say I own a business, and I'm trying to hire engineers. And I really want to make a really competitive product, so I'm trying to hire the best engineers that I can find. And that those engineers have to be able to get to my plant to help me in my production process. Well, if I'm living in a congested area, and if you were to draw the line of, okay, how many people can actually get here within about a reasonable 30 or 40 minute commute during rush hour? And maybe I've got 20,000 people, or maybe I'm just looking for engineers. So maybe I've got 5,000 engineers who could apply for that job, who might actually come and work in my plant. So I got to choose from those, 5,000 engineers, and I'll get somebody who's pretty good. Well, what if the network became less congested, and all of a sudden, instead of 5,000 engineers, there were 10,000 engineers that could apply for my job? What are my chances of getting a better match? What are my chances of getting someone who's going to be more productive and a better fit for what I'm producing? Well, the research that we've looked at has shown that actually businesses that can access a better pool of labor and get the best qualified people in the jobs are much more productive, and they can actually produce more and better products for the same cost as other businesses. And for that reason, if you can make significantly more workforce available within a commuting distance of wherever your business is, you're going to see what we call a market access, labor market access improvement. And that the dollar value of how much more you can produce, and then the profitability that you get on that, which is the value added part of that, can sometimes be counted as a benefit depending on who you ask. Some people would say that it's not, like if you're doing a tiger, you have a hard time claiming that, but in the true economic sense, you can usually call that a benefit. And then the other type of market access benefit is you'll hear about freight market access or delivery market access. Now there, you're not talking about people. There, what you're talking about is you're talking about goods. So what you're saying is, okay, if I'm that computer manufacturer and I'm making these computers, and there it's a much longer distance. But what I'm saying is, if I have to buy plastic for my computers, and there are only 2 companies that make plastic that can get it to me same day, like in the same amount of time I would need to get the order delivered to make my plastic, and there are only 2 companies for me to choose from, well, I'm going to get the best one that I can. But if something can be done, an improvement can be made that makes it where I have 5 different companies to choose from, the research shows that I will in fact get a better deal on that plastic, and I'll be able to make more computers for the same money that I'm investing. On the other side of that, from the supplier, is the downstream market access benefit, which is saying that, okay, once I've made my computers and I'm selling them to other businesses, well, if I have to sell them to businesses that I can get them to within a certain amount of time, I am going to maybe have 30 customers to choose from. Well, if removing bottlenecks and removing impediments to getting my things to market all of a sudden makes it where I have significantly more, like 40 or 50 customers to choose from, those customers have to compete for my computers. So they're going to pay more. And I'm going to actually be able to get more favorable trade conditions, which is going to help my business. And those are market access benefits, which are related to productivity and how effective the business can be. The other type of productivity benefit is the site efficiency, which I've already talked about, which is like the example of the Campbell Soup factory, where they were able to get a whole lot better access, and somehow they were able to use their site in a way that was better, that enabled them to make more soup with the same inputs, simply because there was some reason that they couldn't do that before. So those are productivity benefits. Again, the key to productivity benefits is saying you're not saving the money, but you are able to do more because you have a better transportation condition. Finally, you have contingent development benefits. These are also ones that you may or may not be able to count depending on the type of area that you're in. Contingent development benefits result from new business that is either attracted or created in the economy because of what you've done in the transportation system. And in order to even consider counting them as benefits, it has to be net new economic activity. So yeah, it was an example, if you attract a Motorola plant from China to come to Idaho and start producing things, then the profitability of that plant and what it contributes to the gross regional product can be taken as a benefit, at least to Idaho. Now, if you attract that Motorola plant from Boise to Idaho Falls, again, it's not a benefit to Idaho, but it is a benefit to Idaho Falls. If you want to do an Idaho Falls regional analysis, you can absolutely go to your economic development community and say, hey, look, our gross regional product is bigger because these guys came. But it's not going to fly if you go to ITD and start talking about this as a statewide benefit. So to some degree, whether contingent development is really a benefit depends on a benefit to whom or to what economy. But usually when you hear people talk about contingent development benefits, it's got to be net new to whatever area you're looking at. In other words, it can't be something that was already there. And it can't be something that would have come anyway if you hadn't made the transportation investment. So you have to come up with a really strong connection from the transportation investment to it. However, these benefits definitely do accrue, and you can only count the value added. So if that Motorola plant comes and it sells, $30 million worth of Motorola stuff a year, you can't count the whole $30 million. Because when they made that $30 million worth of Motorola stuff, it's not all stuff that would have been new to the economy because, for example, they're paying out some wage income of people who would have been employed somewhere else anyway. They're paying out of the state, out of the region for goods of production for the stuff that they're getting to make their Motorola stuff out of. So it's only what we call the value added from that contingent development that can really be taken as a benefit. Its other impacts can be taken elsewhere, which we'll talk about in a minute. And again, you cannot count transfers, and we already kind of talked about that. So are people clear when I talk about the difference between a transfer and a benefit? Is that resonating? Because that's one thing that will be very helpful in having discussion. So just as an interesting question. So if, for example, a developer, somebody comes up and says, you know what, we're going to create a bunch of economic benefit in this community because we are going to develop this really beautiful site, and the super Walmart that is located across town is going to come to this wonderful, beautiful site, and they're going to expand. They have like 500 people working there now. They're going to have like 1,000 people working there, and they're coming and they're going to really enjoy this site. And we're going to make a $1 million investment to make this site accessible. And they're even talking about the fact that some of those gas stations might come over here, and maybe 1 or 2 restaurants. And it's just going to be a wonderful place. Okay, is that something that we can count? Any of that as an economic benefit?
That's alternative.
Does anybody think it is a benefit?
Like increase the amount of jobs. You said
Okay.
an extra 5,000 people are going to work there, 500, whatever you said.
Right, they're going to expand, and so if it's a Walmart, what are they doing? What business are they in?
Retail.
They're selling stuff, right? Are there going to be more people to buy things because of this new site? Right, their market's not getting any bigger. You don't have a market access benefit necessarily just because you went to the new site. Now, the question of where those additional 500 jobs, how can you do that? How can you sell this additional stuff? You will not have a contingent development benefit, right? Because that's a transfer. Everybody kind of saw that. How would you know whether there was a market access benefit? Any thought about that?
If there were more people, if they were able to reduce their shipping costs.
Right. If the new site puts them in a place where before there were, 500 people or, 5,000 or however many, 50,000 people who could plausibly shop there, and now because of their access, there's another town 20 miles up the road, and now they can actually access those people, and those people can come and get a better deal on Walmart goods, and Walmart can sell more to them. And before they had to pay a higher price for everything they got because they didn't have a chance to be at Walmart. And now all of a sudden they can come and they can get a better deal and Walmart can make more revenue. Is that a benefit? It might be. It would be a benefit at least to, if you're looking at the local community where that happened, at least the markup, the value added from the Walmart. The problem in that example is that if you have a retail chain like Walmart, how much of that money is going to stay in the regional economy? Right, a lot of that can leak out of the economy, which becomes an issue when looking at impacts. So in the example, and then you often hear about that. People a lot of times when they're doing property development will talk about how many jobs are going to be on this site and what's going to happen, and that's a great economic benefit. So now I'm hoping that people who have been here in this discussion, if that comes up, you can start asking some of these same questions that we're talking about now to see whether there is a potential benefit. And it's not an easy yes or no question, because it's not always the case that just because you're relocating means you don't have any benefit. Now, you probably would have an easier time if instead of a Walmart, it was some kind of manufacturing facility or some kind of a place where they're really producing stuff instead of just selling and reselling stuff. But those are exactly the kinds of things that come up with benefits. And so those are the benefits. Now, back to our Walmart example. Well, what's an impact? An impact and a benefit in economic terms are two different things. So when you talk about jobs, if you remember we talked about benefits, the first thing about a benefit was that it's always counted in dollars. So you say, well, I create 10,000 jobs, or I bring 10,000 jobs. That's an impact. That's not a benefit. What an impact is an impact is showing what the economy does with a benefit. So if you say, okay, I'm going to save some money, and here's an example. Here's an example. There's a firm, suppose, you make a big improvement to the transportation system, and there is a firm that really enjoys a big reliability improvement because now they've tightened up their supply chain. They know within 10 minutes when things are going to get there. They didn't know that before, and they're spending a lot less getting their goods in and out. And so they are able to save $100,000, say, over several years, and they save up that $100,000, and they buy a new machine. And they buy a new machine, they put it out on their floor, and that machine makes it possible for that $100,000 they put on that machine to make and sell $225,000 worth of additional goods. So the machine is a great investment. The $100,000 that they saved, they spent it well, and by selling that $225,000 worth of stuff, they're retaining $20,000 in profits. They're able to hire 2 new people and maybe a part-timer, and they're able to pay $130,000 in wages. So those are really well-paying jobs. So that's a really successful economic outcome, right? So can somebody tell me on that slide, what is the economic benefit?
Increased wages.
Nope, not increased wages.
$20,000.
Nope. Not in that case. Even though some people might count that, but that's not usually what we think of as the benefit. Look at the first sentence on the slide that differentiates the impact from the benefit.
Machine.
The $225,000 for the business output? It's not the benefit. The benefit in this case is the $100,000. Is the $100,000.
I'm sorry, I thought you were asking what the impact was.
No, the benefit. The benefit is the $100,000 because the $100,000 is the value that accrued because of the improvement in reliability. So the transportation performance measure there was the reliability. The reliability created the benefit. And that's the only thing that's really new there. Everything else on that slide occurred because of the $100,000 benefit. So think of the benefits as the parents and the impacts as the children, right? The impacts are the offspring of the benefit. If you don't have a benefit, it's very difficult to have much of an impact other than just moving things around in the economy. So the $100,000 is the benefit, and with that $100,000, you created sales, you created profits, you created jobs, you created wages. But it all traces back to the benefit. So the benefit is always the actual savings or the increased productivity that occurred because of what you did. And this gets into why we invest in transportation, because we want to realize these benefits and we know what the economy can do with them. So when you get into these discussions, if someone starts saying, well, you know, the $225,000, and sometimes they're talking in millions in the long term, and this is just one example, but people run around talking about, oh, you know, you can sell, you're going to get all this new revenue, you're going to sell all this new stuff, that must be a real benefit. Well, actually, the benefit is what's enabling you to do that? What is it about this transportation improvement that enables you to be so much more, to sell so much more stuff? And then the reason has to always trace back to some aspect of transportation system performance. And this is not an unrealistic example. It may not be in one firm, but this is why we invest in transportation, is because all of these things can happen if you can make benefits available to households and businesses. Speaking of what we make available, I put this thing away. So that's what we mean by impact. So here it is. In the case of this little example, your economic benefit was $100,000. Everything else was your impacts. And so the way you would talk about that project or that investment is you would say, okay, we made a $50 million or a $50,000 highway investment in 1 year or over a 2-year period, okay? Within 5 or 6 years of that, $100,000 worth of benefits had accrued. And because of that benefit, we got $225,000 worth of additional business output, $20,000 of business profits, 2.3 jobs, $130,000 in wage income. Another interesting question when you talk about impacts, could you add the $130,000 of wage income to the $225,000 of business output and say that you actually had a $355,000 impact? Anyone want to take a guess at that?
No, because you're taking off part of business output was to pay for
Right.
additional jobs.
Think about what the business does when they sell the output. They sell the output, they got to pay the workers out of the $225,000. And if they're going to retain a profit, that's also got to be retained out of that $225,000. The reason why you're not accounting for everything there is because they also have to pay taxes and they got to pay a lot of other stuff. So you cannot add different types of impacts together. If anyone ever comes to you and says, well, you know, we got this much business sales and then we got this much in wages, and you know, having been to this discussion, hopefully one of the things to take away is to say, well, actually, those are all different expressions of how the benefit is occurring in the economy, but they can't be added together. And the one number that you can take as a benefit is always the 100,000. So what are the sources of impacts? We talked about the sources of benefits. What are the sources of impacts? Well, one of the sources of impact is transportation efficiency. And that goes back to our benefits discussion, that that's just using the benefit from the improved transportation system performance. All those benefits we talked about earlier, safety, environmental, all the savings areas, safety, environmental, travel time, reliability. You take the savings, or what you get for all of those transportation performance areas, and look at what they do in the economy, and you call that a transportation efficiency impact. That's what we're talking about, right? A market access impact goes back to that productivity issue of your market gets bigger, you have more employees to choose from, more people to buy your products, you can have a productivity gain. What you do with that productivity gain, that becomes your impact. Other sources include contingent development, which we'd already talked about. Now before, when I was saying that, well, you have to be careful about counting contingent development, as an impact, you can count it. But the only question is whether it's a benefit or not, right? You can't even say that it's an impact if it's within the same community. Like, if you're just moving somebody down the street, that's not even an impact, that's just, that's just moving somebody down the street. But you can count it as an impact as long as that development is net new to the area. And construction, which is never a benefit. If anyone ever tells you that the state or the federal government is going to come and spend $30 million building something here over 5 years and jobs are going to be created from them building that, and that that's a benefit, is it a benefit? They're going to finish the project, the jobs are going to go away, and so the question is, it's not a benefit. You can't count any construction as a benefit ever, because it's always just transferring money. You took that construction money from somewhere, somebody paid taxes, that money came out of the economy, it went right back into construction. Construction is never a benefit, but it's always an impact, because if you spend that $30 million on construction, then that is going to basically work its way through the economy. There'll be a short-term economic stimulus from the construction, but to enjoy any real benefit, you have to have one of those benefit classes we talked about earlier, which will last long after the project is completed. Otherwise, you have an impact without a benefit. The other thing that will come up sometimes, which is a very worthwhile thing to be thinking about, especially if you're ever talking to political types, is the adverse impact of taxation and tolling. And this is something that people will ask questions about. Recently I did a project in a state where they were building a bridge, and they were going to raise large amounts of money in toll revenue. And they were so much that they could actually build 2 bridges. They were going to improve one bridge, toll it, and take the proceeds and build another bridge, which they were going to use to attract all kinds of business and do a lot of things. And they had a lot of nice benefits for the project, but they were imposing this toll, which was being paid locally. So effectively, we had to take into account when people pay that toll, just like we talked about the fact that with the benefit, with that case in the factory, they get the $100,000 benefit and they spend that out in the economy, and it worked its way through as a stimulus. Well, if a business is having to pay a couple $1,000s a year in tolling, then they can't spend it. And so that money's coming out of the economy, and they're not, and so you actually have a negative impact when you impose a toll or a tax to fund a transportation improvement. So the way to do the impact analysis is that, yes, you can claim all of these great impacts from transportation efficiency, market access, contingent development, but then they have to be weighed against the amount of money you're taking out of the economy and that adverse impact, so you get a net impact. And that is a completely fair thing to happen in the discussion. So there again, you get back to the issue that if you're going to raise a local sales tax to get several $1 million to put in a transportation system, that's fine, but you have to, if you're going to take credit for the construction impact, which is usually what you're doing with that money, you have to also say, well, yes, so you can talk about the fact, well, how much are you doing to the economy for that? So when you hear people talk about economic impacts of transportation improvements, once again, you're going to see them occurring as a result of transportation efficiency, market access, contingent development, and then when you talk about construction, you talk about also where the money is coming from. And at that point, you can have a pretty well-rounded discussion about economic impacts. And again, all these things get to why we invest in transportation, because we invest in transportation because we expect to have positive impacts and benefits happening. Now, you see in some of the other slides, I talk about multiplier effects, which occur on impacts when we talk about impacts. Does anybody want to take a crack at what that might mean?
Oh, sure, it's you get the money in the economy and then it ends up expanding when it's just being used in the economy.
Exactly. Multiplier effects they apply only to impacts. They do not apply to benefits. But what it is, because impacts have everything to do with transactions and how money moves around the economy. Benefits have to do with being better off. Impacts have to do with how that money moves around. So the simplified example I gave earlier of where, okay, you had that $100,000, you bought that machine, you hired those people. Remember that case? Well, actually, you're doing a little bit better than what that example showed, because as you make, in that case, that $225,000 worth of additional sales that they made, you actually are buying other supplies to produce that stuff, right? Whatever it is, you know, you got the machine, but now that you're up and running, you're going to probably buy some oil to put in that machine, or some gas, or some paint to paint it with, or whatever you have to do to keep that going. So to make that $225,000 worth of output, you're going to be buying other things from other people in the local economy, which is then going to mean that they're producing more output. So you're going to have some stimulus that waves out through the economy, and that is basically what we would say is an indirect effect. And that is a multiplier on top of just the business output, the wages, or the income, whatever you got. The other thing is the induced effect is, like we said, you're paying, in that case, I think they said they were going to pay $120,000, $125,000 worth of wages. Well, those wages go back to people in their households, and they can spend it creating a market for other locally serving businesses, whether it's movie theaters, apartment complexes, everything they spend money on. And a lot of that money stays in the economy. Some of it leaks out of the economy. So basically, you talk about multiplier effects, and you can claim more impact than just the direct impact. So whenever you hear people talk about indirect and induced effects, or people talk about multiplier effects when they talk about the impact of a transportation improvement, this is the kind of stuff they're talking about. So the final thing is, well, what about intangibles? We've had a really nice discussion about benefits and the kind of benefits that come from transportation improvements, but what about the intangibles? The beauty of a place. You know, I've done this thing and I've created the scenic byway, and now everybody who drives on it can see the beautiful mountains in the fall, and it's just wonderful, and everybody loves it, and they call up their city councilman, their legislature, and says, oh, thank you for doing this. But yet, does any money accrue in the economy just because it's more beautiful? I mean, it's one thing if you have contingent development, you're attracting tourism, and I'm just saying, it's just more beautiful, it's more livable. Can you count that as a benefit and put a dollar value on it?
Appreciation of home value.
You have you say appreciation?
Home value.
What?
Home value.
You might see some changes in property values. However, there's some question as to whether that would just be a transfer, in the sense that if that home becomes more valuable, it's becoming more valuable relative to other homes, which then have to be less valuable, because there are only so many people that are going to buy homes. There's only so much money people are going to spend on homes. So you probably, if you're attracting a high price for a house over there on that scenic byway, you're making the other homes relatively less attractive. So there's an active debate about the fact that property values could be counted, but they might or might not. So wildlife. You've saved a species from extinction. Is that an economic benefit? What do you do with it? I mean, could anybody think of, do you want to do an actuarial analysis on the value of the life of that species, bird, whatever it is?
Well, if you kept it from going into being added to the endangered species list, and you didn't have to pay all the expenses of that involved.
Yeah, you might be able to get a little bit of saving. You might get a little benefit there. Would that really be capturing the true benefit of saving this species for future generations? Yeah, probably not. So basically, there are intangibles, beauty, wildlife, other strategic outcomes that never occur in transactions. Dollars don't get them. They're often distributive in nature. What about the fact that you have environmental justice? You have a low-income neighborhood, and you've done something that actually makes it where the people in that neighborhood can enjoy a higher quality of life. And yes, you've taken that money from somewhere else, so you've transferred the money. But say you have households where they're getting just a couple extra $1,000s a year, and that means that they can own their own home now. And you're doing that maybe at the expense of some other people who are losing that $1,000 a year, but who don't really behave that differently as a result. That's a transfer. You just move the money. But is it important? Is it valuable to sometimes do these distributive things? Say you have a target industry that you're really trying to attract to Idaho, that you know is going to be important for your economic development strategy. And you attract that industry instead of attracting some other industry that isn't as strategically important. Well, they're both jobs. Maybe they both pay something comparable. But one is supporting a big strategy that could be helping the state's economy later, and the other one isn't. So it's just distributive. But is it important? Probably is important. I mean, how many people here think that these intangible things that we're talking about should be considered when deciding how to spend money on transportation? Right? A lot of people think that it's important. And nationally, the federal government thinks it's important. That's why they have all these livability measures and things like that. And I'm now going to weigh in on an active debate about this, just because I know other people have been talking about it. What I would suggest would be that it is best not to try to monetize that alongside other economic benefits. There are some people who would say, just make up a number, make up a dollar figure of what these things are worth, and let people debate about it, let them argue about it. Just put it in a dollar term so that you can trade it against another alternative. That's what some people say. And some people are able to accomplish things that way, and it sometimes helps people. But there are reasons possibly not to do it. First of all, because it never occurs in a transaction, what happens to the value of money if you just make up a value for beauty? So I have $1 million worth of beauty that I didn't earn, that I can't trade with anyone, and I trade it off against $1 million worth of gas savings on driving. What can happen is I may be corrupting what those dollars worth of gas savings are worth because I'm trading them off against something that I just made up value for. It's a little bit like exchanging real money for monopoly money. And I'm not saying that to say that these intangibles aren't important, but I am saying that the value that you would try to put on them may not be real in transactions terms. When you actually go out and try to use that in the global economy or the national economy and say, I gave up so many $1 million worth of tangible transaction benefits for this other intangible thing, then really the value of those tangible benefits is a little less. Does that make any sense?
But don't you have to put a value to some extent in order to justify it?
You have to do something, right? And I'm going to get in the next slide as to what I think is another way to do it. So one of the problems there is that they don't have a value, they don't occur in transactions. Another thing is they're often distributive in nature, like I talked about. You rob Peter to pay Paul, but heck, Paul needs it more. Well, that's true. But just because you took $100 from Peter and you gave it to Paul, does that make $100 worth $200? Just because Paul has it? What kind of economic decisions are you going to be able to make if you just slapped a dollar value on something and then it may never change? The other thing is you have a problem with long-term versus short-term benefits when you start looking at intangibles, if you start trying to monetize them. Has anybody here ever gotten a mortgage? Or has anybody here ever borrowed money and then had to pay it off with interest over a long period of time? Or watched the TV show Popeye? Have you ever heard Wimpy's expression, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today? So if I wanted $1,000 20 years from now, how much money would I need to invest now to have that $1,000 in 20 years? Less than $1,000, right? In other words, the further off in the future I put that $1,000 that I need, the less money I have to put away today, right? To the point that if I'm trying to get $1,000 in 100 years, I don't have to put much money in the bank right now, do I? The point being that the way that benefits work is the longer off in the future they are, the less that they're valued. And so all of these other benefits, travel time, reliability, safety, the ones that are monetized in transactions, if they're off in the future, they're getting discounted. They're getting discounted because you're trading them off against another investment you might make with the actual dollars that you have in your budget. Well, what about saving a species, a habitat for a species that will occur to future generations, 2 or 3 generations from now? Is it reasonable to even think about treating the value of that comparably to something that would depreciate or something that basically you would borrow against? No, you're never going to do that. You're never going to borrow money or engage in time value of money transactions for things that are for future generations. And a lot of intangible things are for future generations. So it sounds good to think about, well, just slap a dollar value on everything and then you can say what the spotted owl is worth relative to a tank of gas. And I would offer that there are alternatives to that, and that if you keep going down that road, there are a number of issues that can occur. So how do people do this? And what do you do with these intangibles? There's something called multi-criteria analysis. Has anybody ever heard of that before? What this is a way a lot of states are now approaching. You might hear people talk about multi-criteria analysis sometimes. And what it is you have different performance areas. Here you have safety, environmental, mobility, livability, future generations. So you're making a clear distinction between environmental quality and sustainability, right, for future generations. And you can score an investment or a potential option in a transportation economic decision, in this case on a scale of 1 to 5. A 5 would be the best you could get, a 1 would be the worst you could get. Things that you can monetize, like mobility, as we talked about, well, that's great. You can put them in brackets, and you can just give dollar values, what's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 worth. You're converting your dollars into a score of 1 through 5. If something can't be monetized, like future generations, then basically you can write a criterion, and you say, this is the criteria. If you're going to get a 5 for helping future generations, your project must do these things. To get a 4, you must do these things, and you define them qualitatively, so you have this meaningful discussion about what is important about these things. You don't forego that discussion, but instead of trying to have a discussion about in dollar values, what is it worth, you describe the kind of outcome that is desirable and what is required to achieve that outcome. So then you have these scores, and sometimes there's a qualitative discussion if it's a qualitative factor. If it's a less qualitative factor and you can quantify it, you can convert the dollars over, you give it a score. Then you can apply a weight to that score where you say, okay, well now we've said how this project scores on all the different criteria. I'm going to say, well, how important are they? Do I care more about safety and environment than I do about mobility? Do I care more about the livability of my community than I do about future generations? I can weight these. So you have one thing that describes, okay, what does it mean for something to perform well? The second column is how important is it that it performs well? And these are all stakeholder discussions that you have with different people that you might engage in. If you come out in a long-range planning process and come to the meeting, that would be an interesting discussion, right? On a scale of 1 to 5, how important is safety of all the things that I care about? So you can have a really good discussion, and you can come up with a way of differentiating by combining the weight and the score, differentiating the relative value of different possible courses of action without ever making up fake numbers and without ever trying to pretend that you really know the actuarial value of the life of an owl. And you can make decisions that help protect future generations and livability and a lot of other things that are important. So this is what a lot of states, Oregon is doing this, Ohio is doing this, Colorado is starting to do this, other states are looking at it. And I only suggest this because I know a lot of people, when we have these discussions about transportation economics, tell you that you have to monetize everything to have a good economic approach. And one of the things I want y'all to take away from today is that you don't actually have to monetize everything to be doing good economics. In fact, good economics is using dollars when dollars are appropriate and not trying to use dollars when they're not appropriate. Knowing what dollars are worth and what they can measure is part of understanding why we invest in transportation and engaging in discussions about it. So why multi-criteria analysis? Again, it avoids indefensible dollar values that might just undermine your whole decision. It avoids distracting the public debate. You get a bunch of people in a room, and you start trying to put a dollar value on everything, and before you know it, nobody's talking about the trade-off between safety and mobility, or between livability and sustainability, and everybody's arguing about whether the life of a sneaky snake is worth $50 or $35. And that's an interesting discussion about the snake or whatever it is, but is that going to take, are you going to come away from that having had an opportunity to really reflect these values in investment decisions? Probably not. So when people start, if you get in these discussions and people start getting in this, well, what is something really worth? Sometimes a good answer is to say, well, the question is how much do we care about this relative to other things we care about? It also can help focus debate on performance areas, which I think I just talked about. And it recognizes the time value of money and long-term benefits. So it keeps you out of the trap of saying that, well, that's going to happen 100 years from now. Well, just because something happens 100 years from now doesn't mean it's not important. And you can still say it's just as important. What happens 100 years from now could actually be a more important part of our decision today than what happens next year. And if we try to put it all in dollars, we can't talk about that intergenerational sustainability aspect. Then, of course, we also can talk about distributive things. Because all of a sudden, if you rob Peter to pay Paul, or you take money and you give it to a population that needs it more, you don't go and pretend that that money's worth more because it went to somebody else. You just say, hey, we want to improve the standard of living in our community, and we care about that. And that's good. That's good economics. So don't always think that it's better economics just because people talk dollars. So engaging the discussion, okay. When you're engaging these discussions now, having had this nice little course on how to speak transportation economics, things to be thinking about are what kind of outcomes are important. So you go to the public meeting, you go to whatever forum you go to where people talk about transportation economics, talk about what outcomes are important and why they're important. Who experiences the effects and how, and what might the benefits and impacts be. And for the purposes of this group, you don't really need to even get into a discussion about, well, is that a benefit, is that an impact? That's something that you can let transportation economists worry about to a large degree. However, you hopefully can recognize the difference between whether you're actually creating a better situation because you're saving money or allowing people to do more, or whether you're just moving the same money or the same things around the economy. And you can have a meaningful discussion about transportation projects and why we're investing in transportation based on that and based on what we've seen here about the kinds of benefits that we can really expect. So thank you for sitting through this, which again is kind of the more boring part of our discussion, or maybe not boring, but the more cerebral part of the discussion. So I wanted to kind of take a few questions, and we can take a little couple minutes break, and then I can kind of talk in more everyday terms for a little bit about kind of the first, I kind of did the second half first and the first half second, in the sense that why do we invest in transportation, which I touched on earlier as far as understanding the kinds of things that can happen when you invest in transportation and the kind of issues that come up when we have conversations about investing in transportation. So now that everybody here is a transportation economics expert, right, and we all understand about benefits and impacts and where they come from and what they do, I'm going to kind of step back and we're going to look at a more high-level conceptual discussion about, well, all those numbers and terms and things aside, if you're just talking to somebody who hasn't had the advantage of learning what all these different things are, what are some things that you might want to think about and talk about when we talk about why invest in transportation? Of all the things we can invest in, why do we invest in that? One of the big reasons why transportation matters is because of the way that the economy is set up. Has anyone here ever heard of the concept of basic industries and non-basic industries? Okay. Well, basically, no pun intended, the economy is organized into industries, right? Industries are things like agriculture, mining, manufacturing, different industries. Local and statewide economies specialize in certain industries. That means they make things that they sell outside of that region or outside of that state. So a basic industry is an industry where in Idaho we could say, well, potatoes or potato farming is basic to Idaho. You get potatoes in Idaho and you sell them to the rest of the world. Every economy has a certain subset of its industries which are basic industries. In Idaho we talk natural resources, manufactured products, distribution centers, tourism, agribusiness. These are basic industries. We sell our stuff from Idaho to the rest of the world that we make in these industries. The basic industries send money out to send goods and services out to the rest of the world, and that money comes back to Idaho. The money that comes into Idaho from the outside world is the lifeblood of the economy. That is the money that turns the whole wheel of the economy. And that economy is made up then of population-serving industries, which basically are the things on which the money that came in from the basic industries are spent. So that would be your government, your education, your healthcare, your retail, personal services, construction. These are population-serving. The basic industries are a smaller part of the economy. The population-serving industries usually are a bigger part of the economy. So what it is if you think of it like a lever or like a wheel. If you have one little wheel and you turn this little wheel, and then on the other end of the shaft you've got a huge wheel, if you turn that one little wheel, that's turning this big wheel on the other side, if you're mechanically inclined. Does that make sense, the idea that you have a relatively small number of industries that bring the money in? The other industries basically are what that money gets spent on and cater to the market created by the basic industries. So, and the professor will forgive me, I'm giving kind of a simplified explanation. But this is, we have basic trade industries and population-serving industries. Products and services flow out, money flows in, and that money is what moves around in the economy. Goods flow out, money flows in. In the case of Idaho, we're looking at some 2013 statistics. $33 billion came into Idaho in 2013 because of things that were made and shipped out of the state, even if they were shipped only on computer cables, through internet. However, 22 billion of that 33 billion actually came into Idaho in exchange for goods that were sent out on trucks or on truck rail. So $22 billion came into Idaho that wouldn't have gotten here if you hadn't been able to ship this stuff out on the transportation system. That $22 billion is basically 2/3 of all the new money that came into the state. The rest of it that didn't go by truck, the other 11 billion, you see a lot of it went by pipeline, natural gas, and then some of it went by air and a lot of it went by rail. Idaho has a robust mining economy. But these are all transportation facilities of some type. So the whole 33 billion wouldn't be here if you weren't transporting things out to the world. A lot of that is manufactured goods, agriculture and food products. Your manufactured goods, some of them are very high value goods, like the electronics that are made here in Boise are sold throughout the world. Very high value, high growth industry. You have a lot of business services happening here in Boise that are catering to the rest of the country. You have a lot of tourism that is coming, people bringing money into the economy. So these, and of course all the agricultural products. Everybody knows about the potatoes, but also dairy is a big one. Excuse me?
It's bigger than potatoes, actually.
Really, yeah, that's not surprising. The dairy industry is actually one of the examples that we have here. So the basic industries to Idaho we've talked about: tourism, dairy, potatoes, wheat, corn seed, computer chips, lumber and wood products, metal mining, phosphate mining. All of these things you have to get out to the world in order to have money come in and to have an economy that works and churns and grows here. The dairy industry is a really good example of the relationship between basic and non-basic industries in the sense that the dairy farms produce dairy and manufacture dairy products, so that's food manufacturing. But then that supports feed grains, dairy equipment and maintenance, the fuels, the transportation services that people are actually spending. You also have veterinary, accounting, legal services. All of these jobs in Idaho are here because we sell dairy and dairy products out to the world on our transportation system. And that you could do an illustration like that of every basic industry. So these are really important, and they're very dependent on transportation. If you can bring that $33 billion into Idaho, you can grow an economy big enough to have a school system, to have prisons, to have parks, to have a lot of these other public investments. But if you don't have that, that money dries up and it's not there because of the costs imposed that make your goods uncompetitive. That gets back to the benefits, right? The other manufacturing, also Fleetwood Residential Manufactured Homes, Hewlett-Packard, Micron, Simplot, these are all Idaho-based companies that sell a lot outside of Idaho, and they're bringing money into the state. And they simply cannot, look at it, you can't make houses like Fleetwood does and sell them to people in other states unless you have a pretty good transportation system. And to me, that was one of the more interesting examples. But all of these are basic industries that bring money into the states. Now, this is a good example of when we talked about impacts. We talk about transportation and jobs. And what we see, this is looking back for a period of time, you had $19.5 billion worth of freight that moved out by truck in 2013. Now that doesn't include, the other number was bigger because the 22 billion was bigger because it had some truck rail. This is just by truck. That $19.5 billion translates into $7.7 billion of value added. That is essentially retained earnings in the economy and contribution to the gross regional product. $4.1 billion of wages paid to Idaho households, and about 97,000 jobs. Those basic industries, again, are a minority of the economy, 19% of Idaho's business output. But that's what's bringing in all the money that's making the market for everything else. So you not only have money coming in, but that money translates into these other things that are important to the state. And so we invest in transportation so that this can continue happening. And so what happens if you don't invest in transportation is basically that you might still sell some of that output, but the landed price of the goods and their markets is going to be higher. So if you have a lot of wear and tear on your highways and they're coming apart and they have potholes over years and years, or if you have bridges that close and you have a long detour that trucks have to take to get these goods out, the actual cost when the computer leaves Boise, it's worth $1,000, or not it's worth, it is priced at $1,000 for the eventual market. By the time it lands there, the trucking company is going to charge whoever's receiving it an extra 10 or 15 or however many dollars for having to deal with transportation deficiencies. So then what you like to sell is a $1,000 computer is actually going on the market for more than that because the transportation cost shows up in the retail cost of the computer. And if computers from other states are sitting in the same store and they don't have that, isn't Idaho going to sell fewer computers? The market for that's going to go down simply because the landed price of the goods is higher. And that's effectively how the transportation is going to affect this part of the economy, this basic part of the economy that we talked about. Transportation and earnings, wages in traded industries in Idaho, that meaning those industries that are actually bringing money in, those are often higher wage industries as well. Not always. Like for example, medicine, a medical doctor, that's a high wage industry, and if he's only taking care of people, or she is only taking care of people who are making goods for export, well, it's still a high paying job. But overall, wages in the basic industries in Idaho are 23% higher than the median income. So some of the best jobs in Idaho are here because they are making and selling things to the rest of the world in those specialized industries. Growth in traded industries leads to higher wages and bigger local markets for everything else. It's nice to think that you can have a $150,000 engineering job in Idaho because it means you can stay here if you're that good of an engineer and you can make that much money. But the other good thing about it is the engineer who makes $150,000 making computers in Idaho goes out and spends all that money here in Idaho and creates opportunities for everybody else. Whereas if that computer he's trying to sell isn't as competitive when it gets to where it's going, well, then he might not be able to keep doing that here indefinitely, or she. And the quality of transportation system is what enables the money to enter Idaho's economy, as I had talked about. Now, we talk about households. Well, this is all really good, that the business is basically, the business side of this is really important, and we can talk about why we invest in transportation to keep our economy going. But then what about, when I go home and I go to my household, well, we've talked already about one important aspect of how it supports you at home, which is it enables you to earn money to have the nicer house, to have the, all the fun, I don't know if you're into TV or Wii or whatever you have there. The ability to earn that money is definitely tied to supporting the basic industries. But let's just talk about the costs and benefits like we had in the first part of the presentation. Idaho in 2012, remember I talked about the economic benefit classes, the types of classes of benefits that accrue? Well, that happens to households. And in 2012, approximately every household in Idaho, the average, I should say, not every, the average household in Idaho spent $1,495, about $1,500, on the cost of transportation that are sensitive to how the system performs. By that, I'm not talking about the kind of car you choose to drive, and I'm not talking about, basically I'm not talking about your car. What I'm talking about is the gas, the mileage, the environmental, and the crash costs, and those translate into the benefit categories. These are things that benefits might be achieved by improving transportation performance, right? And it does not include insurance either. It does not include parking, but it just includes, in that case, the gas, the mileage, and it also includes the time that you spend traveling. And it will increase to about $1,911 by the year 2030. So just in terms of what your household is spending and the time that may be saved or more of it spent, depending on how efficiently the transportation system is operating and the mileage you put on your car, it's about $1,500. So if you look out again at the benefit stream, or how much money are you spending on things that are sensitive to transportation system performance between 2012 and 2030 in present value terms, right? That meaning if you were going to borrow money or you were going to try to save money that would accrue over this long period of time from now up to 2030, over $20,000 worth of value in that 18-year period from 2012 to 2030. It's a $20,000 value. So in other words, you could buy something for $20,000 and make payments on it out to 2030, and that would be comparable to what your household is spending on these aspects of using the transportation system, some of which could be saved by making the system perform well. Obviously, you are not going to be able to save that whole $20,000 because some transportation costs, there are some areas in which the transportation system is optimal. If you don't experience any congestion, you're in an area that has no crashes, no environmental problems, you're not going to be able to save any of that $20,000. But in as much as you can solve those transportation performance problems, you can save some of the $20,000. And if somehow they come up with a wonderful technology where you can teleport yourself everywhere and there's no transportation that you ever have to approve, you could actually get that whole $20,000. So that's basically just what you're spending on keeping your car going or keeping yourself moving and the time that you spend. Now, in addition to that, the household will spend $819 on roads. That's just what you spend, or what your average household in Idaho is spending on state and federal user fees, those are the gas taxes and things like that. So that's how it's affecting you at home. So to kind of break down this $1,495 number, how are you spending that money on transportation? Well, you're spending money on fuel, gas, and mileage, $616 there, which you might be able to save if you're experiencing any congestion, or other conditions. Even potholes sometimes can affect your fuel economy and the wear and tear on your car. You're spending about $277 a year worth of productive time at work, where you're actually taking a little bit less of your hourly wage because you're working less than a full day sometimes because you have incidents and things that keep you from working. You're probably spending about $375 worth of quality time at home. And again, that's based on what people are usually willing to spend to take time off from their jobs or whatever. If you could still have that time without taking time off from your job, you have about $375 worth of time. $189 worth of crashes and property damage and what you're paying on your deductible when you have to have your car fixed after an accident. And in some cases, there are lives being saved there. And that's factoring into that average. And about $38 worth of environmental and health costs that could possibly be prevented if there was, if you could not have emissions and other problems of that type. So how much could you save? Well, it depends on how many of these problems you're experiencing. But it's likely that households in Idaho could save quite a bit and could actually enjoy at least some of these things happening for them. Now we talked about paying for roads. I mentioned earlier the $819 a year that people in Idaho, households in Idaho, are spending simply giving to the state, or not giving to the state, I mean having tax to the state, so that the state and the federal government can keep the roads going. That is a fixed rate of 25 cents per gallon, which has not really changed since several years ago. I think that's at 1996. Well, today it is buying 36% less transportation improvements than it did back then, simply because those improvements have gotten more expensive. The other thing that's happening is that cars are becoming more fuel efficient. So you can put the same demands on the system by driving the same number of miles and hours that you did before with a lot less gas. How many people's car today has the same fuel efficiency in miles per gallon than it did in 1996? Does anybody know if it's the same? Yours is the same? Same car?
No, but that's the same car, but the same type of car.
Yeah, and it doesn't have any better fuel economy? Anybody driving like a Prius or a hybrid or anything like that? Some people have those. Overall, fuel economy has gotten a lot better and continues to get better. And so what that means is that while people are paying the same amount for the road, they're putting a lot more mileage on it, and they're using it a lot more for the money that they're paying. And what that means is that basically there's less and less money to accommodate that. And that's okay. I mean, it's kind of what happened. Well, I'm saying it's okay, but I'm saying that is an understandable outcome. I mean, nobody's going to say the fuel economy is a bad thing, right? But unfortunately, a side effect of it is that you pay less and less for the mileage and usage you put on the system. And unlike private companies that provide electricity or health insurance or phone service, they can change their rates as the value of the service changes. Like, have you ever noticed companies like Verizon or folks like that? You have access to their network, you pay money to access their network, and they don't need an act of the legislature, an act of Congress to jack that rate up. They can sell you different plans, but basically they can change that rate really whenever they want or whenever your contract changes. And my goodness, the health insurance company, they can certainly change your rates for a lot of different reasons, and they can do it based on market conditions and the value of what they're offering. The electric company can also do that. Certainly anybody who has gas heating knows that those can certainly change when market conditions change. But yet, what we charge or what we spend for access to this highway network, unlike those other networks, it just sits there, and it sat there for 1996 until now, so what is that, 18 years? And so that's just been sitting there at the same rate. It hasn't been changing based on market values or fuel economy. And for that reason, it creates a challenge as far as paying for roads go. And that's why we have these funding discussions. And that's another reason why that there's a lot of discussion going on nationally and at the state level and at other levels about how we're going to pay for transportation. And maybe it is increasing that 819 in user fees. Maybe it's other things, like it's congestion pricing or market-based solutions, or just simply indexing that fuel tax to vehicle miles traveled in the state. In that case, it wouldn't even be a tax increase. If the vehicle miles traveled stayed exactly the same, the tax would never go up. But if it does go up, then the tax keeps pace with it. Something that basically tries to help make that funding mechanism a little bit more reflective of the transportation market. So, and this is something I think we kind of covered in depth before, is we had talked about the fact that you can save money in your household if the transportation system performs better. That alone is a reason to believe that if that $819 went up to even $1,000, if you look at the fact that you have a potential of saving as much as by 2030, $1,900, $1,500 today, you have a good potential of being better off as a result of the investment. But some things are priceless, and this is kind of what we talked about in the last presentation. Some things, well, I'm not going to try to put a value on it. You know, I'm not going to try to put a value on, you know, your spouse or your grandmother or your daughter or son has a heart attack, and you pick up 911 and the ambulance gets there on time and they live. I'm not going to try to put a dollar value on that, but that is an outcome of having a transportation system that works and that doesn't have a lot of obstructions and bottlenecks and other problems, especially if you're in a rural area of the state and the bridge is out, you know, and all of a sudden the hospital becomes 2 hours away instead of, you know, 45 minutes away. The natural environment, which we talked about a lot before, habitats and species and the beautiful places in Idaho that you can go and live and play and work. You can't really put a value on that. You can put a value on the health impacts of emissions, but I'm not going to stand here and pretend that I can do an analysis that's going to tell you what it's worth to you to pay for having this kind of a beautiful place that you have in Idaho to live. I am going to tell you that it's valuable and it's important, and the earlier presentation kind of talked a little bit about how you might talk about it and think about it when doing transportation economics. And the other thing is quality time with the family. I have a 2-year-old at home right now, and there are days that I forget. Anybody ever had a 2-year-old at home and I'm seeing like, oh my God, I gotta get out of here. And I love my 2-year-old to death. But in reality, you know, that time that I spent with her, the fact that I have those hours at the end of the day after work, I have those hours on the weekend, just to be at home and to see her learning how to climb the stairs and sitting around the dinner table, and that I'm not running in halfway through the meal because I was sitting in traffic coming home from work. You can't really put a price tag on that. We can value the time in economic transaction terms, but there are also some things that are priceless, and these are also reasons why we invest in transportation. These are reasons why everyone in this room and other people that you're talking to should be aware of that all these things are things that we are not going to be able to enjoy if we don't invest enough in the transportation system to keep them available to us. So the key concepts from this much shorter presentation are that transportation performance makes jobs and money available in the state, which supports your income at home. Also, improved transportation performance enables households both to earn more money because you have access potentially to a better job, but also to save more money if you can cut back on some of the costs that we talked about. The costs of highway infrastructure are less than the cost of the time, mileage, and other factors that can often be saved by system improvements. And the payoffs of transportation investment always can go beyond dollars. And that was kind of a long discussion we had earlier, and it's very true even at the conceptual level. And so I appreciate your taking the time. I think we've managed to use up most of our time, but I think we have a few more minutes if anybody has a discussion, comment, or question, or wants to bring anything up.